In this tutorial, we are going to be starting to actually use the tools and learn how to use Cinema4D. In order to do that, we are going to be building the tower part of the Planet Express from the TV show Futurama. The reason for this is, honestly, this model just makes life easier. It's going to be able to teach us a lot of skills, and we can use primitives to do most of it. There are certain details we are not going to add as part of the tutorial. You are free to do so afterwards if you like. But we're going to be focused on the primary, the primary forms of this model as we go. Okay, and this tutorial is going to be broken up into several parts because there's a lot to go over into building something like this. And so we're going to start with this tutorial. We're just going to make really the basic forms, and then we're going to build from there. So open up Cinema4D if you haven't already, create a new file. We could go ahead and save this right now so we don't forget. And then something else, if you haven't already, please go to Preferences, go to Files, and check mark the auto save option every 5 minutes. That way you don't have to think about it. It's going to save a backup file, and it will save up to 10 different copies, and that will be fantastic. But it doesn't do any of that unless we start by saving the file first. So let's go ahead and save. You can hit Command S on the Mac or Control S on Windows, or you can go to the menu and go to File and Save. And so I'm just going to call this Planet Express. And I'm going to actually put this in the correct place, which is here, and hit save. Okay. So if we look back at our reference image, you'll see that there are some primary forms here. And one of the keys to 3D modeling is to understand what base architecture, what base geometry is going to get you the closest to making the object as efficiently as possible, right? And so if we look at this shape, obviously a sphere is going to be useful in part of this. And then if we look at the bottom, and granted, right, some of it's cut off, but that doesn't matter. I know more or less what it looks like. We could look at other references if we want to. But you'll see that the general shape of this is like a cone with the top cut off, or maybe the cone hides inside the center of this. We don't know. But it's a cone with the top cut off. It looks like there's a couple rings here, which we could either do as toruses, or we could do it with more geometry than that. It's up to us. And it looks like there's a footer. Then there's these like inset things, the inset windows. There's some arched windows that are up here. And it looks like there's a couple other kind of flatted, maybe a ring, maybe a cylinder up here, and like and the cylinder here where those windows are, but then like a flatted cone as well. And then another potential cone, maybe a pyramid that's a lattice work, and some other objects up on top of that, right? And then there's this ring and a disc, right? So we can start to see these basic shapes that make up the object, and that's where we're going to start. We're going to start by building that very basic architecture or geometry in order to make this thing happen. And you'll notice the entryway has some similar forms as well. Okay, so we're really just going to block this thing out to start with. And so to start with, let's go ahead and create our cone. And so to create a cone, what we're going to do is we're going to go over to our primitives, and you will see that one of those primitives is a cone. Fantastic. So we've got a cone. One thing you'll note is that the center, when you create this, is that the center of the cone is at 0, 0. We really want this to be, right, this should be the bottom of the cone that we're using, but currently it is not. And so, and we want that to be level with the ground plane. So we're going to need to move this a little bit. And also, we don't need the cone to be this sharp. We are going to want a gentler slope on the side. And so let's look at some of the settings that we can adjust. First, we can adjust if we go to the Object tab, we have the cone selected. We go to the Attributes Manager, select Object, and we have several options here. We have a top radius, a bottom radius, height segments, rotation segments, etc. I'm going to leave this at a height of 200 centimeters. We could scale this to be the size of the building, but we're not going to do that. We're just going to leave it the way it is now. We're going to leave it at 200. And what we actually need to do is we need to lift this up so that it's level with the ground. Since we know the height's 200 and by default the axis ends up in the center of that distance, if I click on if I toggle the active view so I can see the side view, you'll see that that is right there in the center. So I could do two things. I could either manually drag this up and hope for the best and get it as close as I possibly can here, or I could use the coordinates tab on my attributes manager and set the Y position to 100 centimeters. If I just type that in, it's going to pop it right up where I want it to be. Now, there are some snapping options we can do and things like that, but for now, we're just going to be using that default setting. And then while we have these 4 views open, we also need to adjust, if we go to the Object tab, right, we also need to adjust that top radius. If we look back at our reference image, right, you can see that the slope isn't anywhere near as steep as what it currently is, and it truncates, if this is 200 centimeters tall, whatever, right, we can see that that top radius needs to be significantly wider. And we are going to be freehanding this because this is an illustration and there are no measurements. We're going to try and make it look as close as possible. In the previous iteration of this, I do actually have numbers that I used, and I did the whole thing beforehand, but I don't have a whole lot of time this time, so we're just going to go wild style on this. All right, so let's say we're going to start by saying, let's do the top radius at, the bottom radius is 100. Let's try 75. Okay, so that looks like it might be a little bit too big. So let's go down to 60. And that looks a lot more accurate in terms of dimensions. So I'm going to say I'm pretty happy with that, and I'm going to leave it as it stands. Okay, so we've got the base started. Let's look at what other parts there are on the base. You'll notice that down at the bottom, there is a footer that goes along the bottom edge. And then we've got these other rings up here. So let's go ahead and we'll just make this out of a cylinder. It looks like there's a slope here. And we may go in and put that in a bit, but we're going to start by just leaving it. Right, we're blocking it out. We're trying to do this quickly to get these base shapes down. So if we come over here to our primitives, you'll see that we also have the ability to make a cylinder. So I'm going to go ahead and drop a cylinder in. And you're going to notice that the cylinder defaults right to the center as well. And it is not quite as big as we'd like it to be. Now, because we're trying to learn different techniques here, we're going to go ahead and go back to our perspective view as just one window. And you can see that this has this, right, the yellow line here. That means that that is going to allow us to adjust the height and the width of our cylinder. So I'm going to go ahead and just expand this out until it's about the right width. It needs to be a little bit bigger. And then I'm going to shrink the height maybe. Although for whatever reason, it's not letting me adjust the height. I don't quite understand why. Oh, I bet if I rotate my view, let's see here, if I hold down 3 on the keyboard, or if I was to go to this orbit button here and rotate around, you can see that little dot for the height was hiding behind the green arrow. And so that is something to be cautious of. Oftentimes these things are really close together, and if I click on the arrow and drag it, I'm going to move the whole thing, which isn't exactly what I want to do. I want to pull this down until I'm in a happy place with about how much height I want. Now, right, this is cutting into the ground plane, and so I'm going to want to adjust the vertical position of this. And again, it'd be easiest to do this with the coordinate manager over here using coordinates. If I go to my front view and make this full size and zoom in a little bit, right? Remember, if you click 2, if you hold down the number 2 and drag, you can do that, or you can click drag on this button up here. So I've scaled my camera, and we'll see that we've got this. Now, if I go to my coordinates, or sorry, my object, we'll see that my height is 21 point, right, 0081. Do I want to do the math and divide that? I don't, right? Because what I need is it to be half the height, raised half the height for the bottom of the edge to be on the surface of the Earth, right? So what I can do, which is kind of crazy, is I can copy this value. And I could also just make it 20 and then know it's 10. But I just want to show you one of the possibilities of ways you can work in Cinema, which is pretty fantastic. So I've copied this value, go into coordinates. I'm going to go to the Y. I'm going to paste it in here. And before I do anything else, I still have the cursor in there. I'm going to go and say, use the division symbol, say divided by 2. I'm going to hit enter. And that's automatically going to do the math for me. And it's going to raise that up exactly halfway where I want it to be. So that's something that's really powerful in Cinema, and is that instead of just being able to punch the numbers in there, you can actually do mathematical equations in there to figure out where things need to be or how many degrees to rotate or whatever. So for simple things like, you know, the axis is in the center and dividing by 2, that's great. But you can do much more complex things as well. If you wanted to just say, oh, I need to add 5 to this or add 15, you can just say plus 15 and it'll pop it up 15 more units. It's pretty magical. Okay, so let's go ahead and go back to our perspective view and just take a look, right? Perspective view is great because that's how we see and understand the world. And so oftentimes we don't fully understand like if things are scaled correctly and accurately unless we see them in this view. And so if I pop this over, you can barely see this footer. I think my footer is too wide. I need to make it narrower. So I'm going to go ahead and shrink this dimension in a little bit because it looks like it's more about there, right? That's probably good. At least initially for the start. One of the nice things about using primitives is that I can continue to adjust these settings until I'm happy with them. As long as I get them close to start with, then we can go through and we can be like, we can tweak them as we go. So one of the other things I want you to notice right now is that though this is reasonably round, it's not perfectly round, right? We're getting these like very hard corners. And that's one of the settings that we need to talk about. So the first thing I want you to do is go up to the menu for the viewport, right? Remember, there's 2 menus. There's this top menu that has a bunch of options, like a lot of options up there. And then there's a menu for each one of our different windows or different panes in the view in Cinema. So I want to go to display, and under shading, I want to say Gerard shading lines. What this does is it shows me the actual geometry of these objects. There's this, if we have the cylinder selected, or the cone, actually, let's just do the cone. You'll see that there's this tag called Fong. What Fong does is it basically is a way to fake geometry that doesn't exist, right? So what it's doing is it's artificially rounding this object. If I was to select this Fong tag here, and I was to I'm going to set my angle limit to 0. This is what the geometry actually looks like, right? It's actually this really faceted object. And so Fong accommodates for some of that, but you'll notice that, hold on a second. You'll notice, and 40 degrees is the default for this object. You'll notice that although it rounds it somewhat, it still has these hard corners. And so what we need to do to make this rounder and smoother, and it's something you should pay attention to, especially as you get into modeling more photoreal things, or even anything that has any rounding whatsoever, is you shouldn't stick with the base geometry unless that makes sense. And so what we need to do is I've got the cone selected. I'm going to go to Object, and you'll see that I have these height segments and rotation segments. For our purposes, this number of height segments is fine. But the rotation segment, 16, is pretty low. If we boost this up to 48, right, we're going to get we still have those same hard angles, those same hard edges between the right? You can still see some faceting when we zoom in, but depending on where we end up setting our camera and all of that, this higher density is going to make it so that this edge looks a lot nicer when we go and render this eventually. Okay, so I've set that to 48, and because these objects are expected to be one and the same, and this footer is also smooth and round, we should go ahead and select our cylinder, and you'll see that there's rotation segments and height segments on this. 4 height segments is fine, but again, let's just make this 48 so that they match, right? And now we get a much rounder and smoother looking piece of geometry. If we go to, for this cylinder while we're here, note that I said that, right, if we look at this, there's like a little bit of a bevel on this edge. If I come over here and I go to caps, one of the things I can do is I can turn on this fillet option. So I'm going to go ahead and check mark that. And you'll see that what that does is it rounds, it's actually going to round both the top and the bottom, which is fine. I'm not super worried about that. But the caps are basically, right, the top and bottom surface of this object. And so again, like I said, I'm not really worried about the rounding on the bottom edge, but that top edge is what I'm looking for. And you'll see that right now it's too round. I actually want that to be faceted. And so what I can do is right now I have these 3 segments, right? Basically what it's doing is it's saying, from the cap to the edge, it needs to have 3 segments, right? The segment, 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 or polygon, 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 right? And so it rounds it some. But if I set this to 1, right, I'm going to get that facet just like that's in this drawing here, right? And so you can see that if I look closely, that facet actually goes right up to the edge of the cone. So now that I've got this set, what I can do is I can either, I can make some adjustments. So I can either increase this radius, right? If I increase the radius here, right, you'll see that what it's going to do is it's going to slide in there, but that's not what the tower looks like. So what I should probably do is go to my object tag and shrink this radius some. So I'm going to go ahead and click on the slider. Oop. And I'm going to try and get this radius pretty close to that. You'll see there's a little lip there. So maybe I'm going to say, okay, this should be like maybe 98. 98's too small, right? So I'm just going to feather this up and down until I'm happy with it. 99. That's pretty good. It looks like if I was to zoom in further by holding 2 and clicking and dragging, right, there might be a little lip there, but that's actually probably going to look better in the final render. Something to note with these objects is that having little edges or bevels or things like that makes it feel like it has dimension. Whereas if they have perfectly crisp edges on everything, you lose some of the realness of the object because that's not how the world works. If you look at every object around you, even ones with very sharp edges or hard corners, you'll see that there is still a little bit of a bevel on everything because that's the way the physical world works, right? It's impossible or near impossible or insanely expensive to make something that's atomically perfect to a corner, which is what, right, computer software does by default. Okay, so you'll notice that the toe of my building is sticking out a little bit at this point. So I could, what would probably be best is to actually decrease the height of the cylinder a touch. So I'm going to go ahead and make my cylinder 18 tall. And then I'm going to go ahead and increase this radius. After I make it 18 tall, I'm going to go to my coordinates and just say 18. I would just say make this 9 for my y. And then I'm going to increase the radius a little bit, right? And I'm just going to say 100 to start with. And then maybe I'll say 102. Actually, 100 kind of works. But I'm going to go ahead and pull this down a touch in direction. So I'm hovering over the green arrow for the axis of this. I'm just going to go ahead and snug this all the way down. Perfect. In the end, I may, and you'll see that, right, this is actually putting it a little bit below ground. But as I said, right, this I know just terminates flat at that concrete slab. And so if we were to build a sidewalk around this, this part of the model would be hidden. And that's kind of what we want. And you will notice, you see this weird edge thing happening here where we can see a little bit of pokiness. What that means is that a tiny bit of this is poking through at the bottom. So we may just want to make this like 100.1 in radius, and that will clean that edge up, and we won't have that strange intersection any longer. Now, when we go to merge these two things together, we may have some issues. And so, but those issues are great to find now while we're doing a tutorial, because then you will definitely have issues when you go to work on your own things, and you'll have some experience knowing how to deal with that. Okay, so it looks pretty good to me. Let's go ahead and take a look. Yeah, I think this footer should actually be a little bit wider. Let's go ahead and make it 105. And then we could either make this taper bigger, or we could just leave it as it stands and say, you know what, there's going to be a little bit more of a foot on this. Because I want this to not take any more time, we're going to go ahead and leave it there. And we can always fix that in the future if we need to. Okay, so then let's look at the next piece of geometry we need. I think it would probably be best to actually get our sphere down. And I want you to note it's like, its diameter is almost even with the outside of this, the yellow part down here at the base, the footer. So we're going to go ahead and drop this sphere in. And let's go ahead and look at the radius of our cylinder. We have that set to 105. So I'm going to go to my sphere. I'm going to set my radius of my sphere. I'm going to set it to 105 as well. It should be nice and balanced. And then I'm going to go ahead and drag this thing up and set it somewhere on there. And if I go back and forth between my reference image, you can see it looks like the bottom of the sphere is probably resting on top of this cylinder. So let's go to one of our side views. We can go to the right view in this case. It doesn't really matter. And something to note, if I hit the letter H on the keyboard, what that's going to do is it frames the objects and frames my entire scene, right? So if I go to what that letter corresponds with is if I go to View and I go to Frame Geometry, that's what this is. H is Frame Geometry. If I just wanted to frame the sphere itself, I can hit S. So let's go ahead and try that. We'll hit S, right? So it zooms in just on the sphere. If I hit H, fantastic. Now, one of the issues people have is you'll be in this view and you'll try and orbit the camera. And so if I click and drag, suddenly I've made my view angled. And then when I try and get it back, it's like a nightmare to actually try and get it to line up again. And so in that case, what I can do is I can go to View and I can go down to Frame Default. If I do that, it'll snap it back to wherever it's supposed to be. Now I could hit H again and get it up close. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and lift this up until it's more or less, it could intersect a little bit if we want, it doesn't really matter. But we want it, I'm going to maybe have it intersect at that first edge there. And again, it doesn't, right, we're recreating a cartoon. Precision isn't necessarily super important for this model. Okay, so we've got our sphere on there. You can see that. So let's go ahead and see what we want to do in terms of the next steps. All right, so the next steps, we need to put a disk in here somewhere. Looks like a little bit lower than halfway up. We also need these in here, and these don't look quite like, the bottom one looks like a disk, and the top one looks a little bit more like a really low poly torus. So let's go ahead and do both of those. We're going to start with the torus. So if I come over here, or the donut, if you prefer calling it that, I'm going to come over here. I'm going to go back to my perspective view, and I'm going to hold on the cube. I'm going to scroll down to the torus and select that. And you'll see that the torus has several settings. It's got the ring radius, ring segments, pipe radius, pipe segments. and orientation. Orientation, just as a heads up, it basically means should it start out, what direction should it point to start with, right? Y plus is the default, and that's actually exactly what we want, so we're not going to mess with that. But the ring radius and the pipe radius, right? The pipe is the tube around here, and so the pipe radius is how wide that tube is. So if I crank this down, you'll see that it stays like the same dimensions as the ring, but it's getting fatter and smaller. Whereas if I was to fatten this up and I was to increase this, then we're getting a much wider ring that way. While we're doing this. So I'm going to leave this huge for a second, just so that it's easier to see what's going on next. So we want this to be really smooth and perfectly round, in one direction, but we want it to be faceted in the other direction. So if I was to say, all right, let's go ahead and see what happens if I increase my ring segments, or let's decrease our ring segments to 4. Right, so that's the wrong one, right? We don't want that. We actually want to increase the ring segments. Let's do it to 64. Right, that's going to make that smoother. You can still see some faceting. So we could even say, well, let's do 128. And I'm just doing these numbers. They're multiples of each other. It doesn't really matter. So 128 makes a really smooth ring. It might be too much geometry. We can always tone that down. But the pipe segments, let's go ahead and set that to 4. Right, when I set that to 4, now we get this much more faceted looking object. And it might be a little bit too much for that. So maybe we set this to, let's try 5. And if we rotate this view, we can see that that flats that top surface. That actually might be a little bit closer. We could also try 6. And really part of this is just sort of seeing what looks most accurate. I'm going to say let's go with 6. I mean, 5 is nice because it that top edge is going to cup, but that whole top edge is going to be hidden. It's going to be obscured by the sphere. So let's go ahead. We'll leave it like this, and let's. Oh, somehow I set that back to 3. Let's set this on 6. There we go. And then, so what happens sometimes is if this is still highlighted and you hit 3 to rotate your view, sometimes I do this all the time, but I'll accidentally set this value to whichever quick key I touched. So I'm going to go ahead and lift this up some, and obviously this ring is ginormous. So we are going to set this to something smaller. And I know the ring radius needs to be smaller than the sphere radius. I'm going to set it to 50 to start with. And obviously my pipe radius is too big. So I'm going to set this to 15. And that might be too small, but let's go ahead and zoom in. We're going to lift this thing up. And I'm going to go back to my reference image. And yeah, it seems like it needs to be a little bit bigger. It looks like maybe that's the right dimensions for the ring below. But we're going to go ahead and set this to... set the ring radius to, let's just try 75 now. Scoot this up a little bit and see if that's going to be too high up the sphere. It looks like it might be a little too high up the sphere. We could also decrease the number of polygons on the sphere so that it matches the edges in the model, which might make our life easier. It looks like this would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe 8. So let's try that. Let's say sphere, and you'll notice the segments are set to 32. Let's set that to 8 and see what happens. That's too few. Let's set this to 16. That's right. It's still not perfect, but it actually aligns a lot better. So let's go ahead and keep that for the time being. And you'll see that this ring, oops, I'm going to select the ring. We'll see that this ring actually needs to be a little bit smaller in diameter. So let's go down to 60. And I'm going to rotate my view a little bit. Raise this up a touch. It looks like it. So what I'm trying to do is get this top edge to touch this edge here. So I'm going to try and make that maybe 65. Scoot this up a little bit. 65 is just about right. I'm pretty happy with that as it stands. If we go to our model, it looks like it might be a little bit too big. So maybe the pipe radius we could set to, let's set it to 12. And that looks like it might be a little bit better. Oops. And then maybe the segments, let's try 8. 8 might be too much. Let's see what 7 looks like. Really, I'm just trying to get this to be a little less pokey. So 8 might be a better number. It doesn't, really matter. You can set it to whatever you're happy with. And then I'm just going to pull this up a little bit and maybe make the radius a little bit smaller. You can see that's kind of hanging out a touch. So I'll make this 63 and see what we get. And yeah, I think that should probably be good. Okay, so we've got that set. So now let's go ahead and do our that second disk. One thing we could do, right, we already have this flatted cylinder down here, or flatted cylinder. Yeah, it is a flatted cylinder. Sorry, my brain said cone. What we could do is we can always copy and paste things. So if I select this cylinder, I can either hit Command or Control C and Command or Control V and paste it, and I get this cylinder -1. And then if I click here, I can drag this up. And because we've already got certain settings set, I can go through here and, the thickness is just about right. It might need to be a little bit thinner. But, we just need to then take this edge. Oh, and that's actually, right, adjusting the bevel, which is pretty awesome. That's a new feature. But I'm going to go ahead and just pull this down. We don't really need a bevel on this. If we look at the drawing, it might be nice to have a tiny bevel because, as I said, right, it's going to make things look a little bit more real. Not that this is a real image, but let's go ahead and turn the bevel off for the time being. So I've got cylinder 1, go to caps, uncheck fillet. And you can see that that looks honestly significantly worse. So we will fix that in a second, but let's pull this up so that it matches, and we'll just look and see and say, yeah, and it should be a little bit narrower. So I'm going to grab this and just shrink it down a little bit more so we get a little bit of that edge down there. And now, right, I'm kind of regretting the octagonal shape here, but you know what? We're going to make a little bit of an adjustment on this, and that's probably too much inset. Let's go ahead and pull this out just a touch more. All right. And this one, if we click on our object for the cylinder 1, we've got 48 rotational segments. If we go to our torus, let's see what happens if we do 48 here. Right? Okay, so now they all have the same number of rotational segments, which helps them look a little bit better. And you can see that this is still, right, a little bit sticking out. But let's go ahead and go to our cylinder, and we're going to turn back on our fillet. But the fillet is really too big, so I'm going to squish this down some to maybe let's go to 0.5, 0.5. All right, so now we've got a little fillet, and you can see it's still sticking out a little bit more than I'd like it to, so I will grab this top little dot. Oh. Or I will use the slider over here on the Object tab, and I'm going to say let's just make this 69 to start with and see if that's okay. Let's go to 68. That's probably too much, though. No, that looks like it'll be about right. Okay, so we've got our two rings there. Let's zoom out a little bit. We're starting to get something that looks somewhat similar. Again, right, maybe this is maybe I need a different number of facets on this, but I'm not going to worry about that right now. Okay, now we have turned on autosave, so things should be saving automatically, but it's always a good option to go ahead and save something once we've made some progress. So I just hit Command S or Control S to save it. Something else to note now is, like, if you start looking at our hierarchy, things get pretty messy pretty quick, right? If you can imagine, like, this is a very simple model. You can imagine what's going to happen if I just have, like, if I had like 10 more toruses and 5 more cylinders and this disc and all the cylinders around the circle and all of those things going on, it's going to get really confusing as to what object is what in here. And so one of the things you can do very easily is you can select a name, you can double click on it, and you can edit any of these object names. So I'm going to call this the base cone. Right, and this first cylinder here, I'm going to call this the base. Oops, I'm going to double click. I'm going to call this the base footer. I'm going to come to the sphere. We can probably just call it the sphere at this point still, because I don't even know what to call that other than the sphere. It could be a globe, I guess. Yeah, let's call it the globe. Right, because that's what it is. It's a Planet Express. And then this torus and cylinder here, we can just call these. I don't know what we would call this. We could call this base, or we could call this. I don't know, joint torus. Who knows? And maybe joint cylinder. Okay, so we've got all of these things set up. That's fantastic, right? Now, we don't really have a hierarchy right now. We just have a bunch of objects together in a scene. And we're going to turn them into an object that's all connected eventually, but we're going to add a few more things before we start that process. So the next steps, right, we need to add a disk that's going to end up being this deck. And another torus that's going to end up being this railing. We're going to wait on these cylinders for a second, and we're going to go ahead and add the other elements that come up here, and a pyramid, and we're not going to worry about the top of the antenna at this point. And then we need to add the basic door entry and this Planet Express cylinder as well. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that little disk. So I'm just going to go ahead and create a new disk. I'm not going to use a disk, right? Because a disk is just a flat. All this is a it's just a plane, right? There's no depth or dimension to it, and so though it has many uses, this is not one of them. We want that thickness, so we are going to use a cylinder, and we can go ahead and let's just go ahead and move the center of our cylinder. We want the center of the cylinder to be aligned with the center of the sphere in the x dimension, right? Currently, everything is set at 0, 0, and then whatever the y dimension is. I think I said x there, but I meant y. So one thing we can do is we can go to our globe, and we can go to coordinates. We can select the y value. We can copy that, and we can go to this new cylinder, and we can go into the y value, and we can paste it and hit enter. Right, and that's going to center our cylinder in the center of our sphere. And the cylinder, why don't we go ahead and rename this right now? We're just going to call it deck. And then now we can either use the values under the object tab for the radius and height, or we can do it freehand in the editor and then get a little closer with those values, which is the way I tend to prefer to work. But it's really up to you. So I'm just going to scale this out some, scale this down a lot. All right, and so now we've got this deck. If I look at the view over here, you'll see that it seems like it might need to be, if I kind of go from the same camera angle as is in the scene, it looks like it needs to have a little bit more width. It needs to stick out a bit more. That's probably better. And you'll also notice right now it's really jagged, but it's very, very smooth in the drawing. And so I'm going to go ahead and increase the number of rotation segments. And since we're doing 48 for everything right now, we're just going to say 48. I'm going to go ahead and for the globe, temporarily make that 48 as well, just so everything kind of flows together. And you can see, right, everything aligns. It's kind of gorgeous. Okay. So we've got our deck. Now we need the railing for the deck, which, is clearly a torus. And so let's go ahead and create a new torus. And we will plop this down wherever I just lost the torus. There we go. And we can go ahead and call this deck railing or just railing because there's only one. And I spelled it wrong, but that's okay. And now, right, so this pipe radius is going to be pretty small. It's like 3 centimeters or something like that. However, the ring radius is probably will start as the same as the deck radius, right? So the deck radius is 139 something. I'm going to go ahead and copy that value because there's a lot of decimals there. And then I'm going to go to my railing. I'm going to go to my ring radius. I'm going to paste that value in there and hit enter. And now I can raise this up. And I'm not going to worry about exactly where this is yet. But I want you to note that, right, the center of that radius is the outside edge, right? Because the way the torus works is the center of the ring is the radius, right? So or the center of the pipe is the radius, not the outside edge. So we're going to need to be able to align these a little bit better. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to click over here. We're going to click again to go to our top view. And we are going to zoom in. We could either hit H to zoom in, and that just frames it exactly, or you can hold down 2 and click and drag. It's up to you which way you want to do it. And from here, I'm going to zoom in just a touch more. And it's really kind of hard to see the edge here. If you want to, you can change this display from lines to garage shading lines, which is going to give us a little bit more visibility. And I believe this center dot is the one that's going to adjust the ring radius. Yes, it is. And so now I can get this pretty close, but what I should probably do, right, is set my ring segments to 48 again, right? Because then I get a much better view of if this is actually aligned with this. And the other question is, do I want this to be all the way out to the edge? Do I want it to be inset a little bit? We could look at other references. I'm just going to set it to the edge just like that so that, it's easier to work with. Okay. So now, because for most use cases, and I'm holding 1, I'm clicking, I'm moving this, I could also hit H. I know that I'm going to want lines. I'm going to switch this back to lines. I want you to note that there are these, you'll see this N tilde G or N tilde F. One of the things, because Cinema likes you to be able to use the keyboard as much as possible, all that means is that if you hit the letter, for changing this to lines, back to lines, if you hit the letter N and then G, and note if you hit N but you don't touch anything else, it tells you what each letter will do if for the next letter you hit. So if I hit N and then hit G, this is going to go back to garage shading lines. If I hit N and then B, it'll be garage shading and lines. If I hit N and G, it's just lines, right? So that's another way quick keys work in Cinema. There's like depth, like menu depth that happens. But just note if I hit N and then move my mouse at all, that menu disappears, right? It doesn't mean that I can't then hit B, although it looks like there's a certain amount of time I've got, right? Because it actually selected a different tool than what I was using. So I'm going to go back to the move tool. And right, so if I hit NB, I have to do it pretty quickly. And G back there. And there's others for selection stuff. U is the character. For modeling tools, it's M. And then, right, so if I hit M, a different menu pops up. If I wiggle this out of the way, if I hit U, a different menu pops up. And so you get the idea that there's just a lot of possible things, and it makes it really efficient to work. Okay, so we've got the railing, and we need to do 2 more things, and then we will take a break and separate this out to another tutorial. Okay, so let's go ahead and do the top details on the model. We're going to go ahead and do 1 more cylinder. So I'm going to go ahead and take a cylinder, In this case, I'm just going to drag this thing up until it's close to centered on the top. Then I will switch my view. Hopefully you're already starting to understand some of the like workflow that happens here and how you can efficiently start to model things. And with this, again, it doesn't matter if it's perfect, it just needs to be reasonably close. And then I'm going to go back to here. And if we look and go back here, and if we look at this, all we're doing is where these windows are going to be. So it's going to be pretty stubby and much narrower than it currently is. So we will go ahead and shrink this in just a touch. And I might try, I'm going to leave it at this that edge right there. And I'm just doing this because it's kind of convenient to use the existing geometry as a guide. It doesn't really, as I said, it doesn't really matter because we're doing a cartoon. And with this one, I don't even care about lifting it up, like lifting it up and making sure that it's right centered here. I'm going to leave it intersecting the top of the dome because we're not modeling anything inside of this and nobody's ever going to see it. So we can just like leave it a little sloppy in there for this, right? That's one of the other things with modeling is understanding, doing only enough work for how that model is going to be used. If it's something that's going to be your foreground object, right, you're going to want as much detail as possible. If it's something that's like, if this was off in the distance and you had, something else in the foreground, right, we are doing, we don't even need as many, polygons as we currently have on here. We could make this much more simplified because nobody's going to see it. Okay, so, and then it's also cheaper for your computer when you render things. All right, so we'll go ahead and leave that there. We might need to scale it down at some point, but let's go ahead and create another cone at this point. And we will drop a cone in here, wherever the cone may be. I just am blind. There we go, cone. You'll see that I can't see it right now. If I hit H, it's going to center all of this. I'm going to go ahead and oops, well, I'm going to make that taller on accident, and then I'm going to go ahead and drag this up. Obviously, this cone is absolutely enormous, so I'm going to go ahead and reduce the height dramatically. And if I look at this picture again, right, this cone it terminates in another cylinder, right, and it doesn't, it overhangs this other geometry some, but it's again flatted. So I'm going to go ahead and select my cone, go to Object. I'm going to increase that top radius some. I don't know how big I want it to be yet, but just so I have some sense that that's going to happen. I'm going to shrink this down, shrink my height down, which I don't know why it's not letting me grab that, but I'm going to zoom in a touch. Maybe I just need to, there we go. So I'm going to shrink this down some, and I'm just going to drag this down until it's a little bit closer. I'm going to switch views so I can see from the side, and maybe I'll just do this view, and I'm going to hit S. Right, so then S, remember, is just zooming in on the object I have selected. And so I want this to go and touch or maybe intersect with this other one just a tiny bit. And then I'm going to go ahead and pull this bottom edge in because I don't need that much overlap. And then I will drag this top edge down, and I'm just using these grid lines here on the work plane. And it looks like that might work, but I actually have no idea until I look at the perspective view. And if I rotate my camera a little bit and pop back to my reference, you can see it actually needs to be, it looks like it needs a touch more overhang, and it needs to be just a little bit narrower. So with these 4 windows open, I'm going to pull this overhang out just a touch, and I'm going to shrink this top edge down just a touch more, maybe one more grid mark in that view. And then I don't know if I look at that view, that's pretty good. I might actually expand this just a touch, but then maybe I flatten it just a little bit too. And you'll notice, right, it is flattening around the center point, so I just need to drag this down just a touch more. Okay. I think I'm going to call that good. And now we just need to create one more cylinder to put on top of that. So I'm going to go ahead and actually copy the cylinder that I have already because it's pretty close to what I need. And so I can just use this cylinder to get me closer to the final cylinder I need. Another way you can copy and paste objects is really, they kind of call it more duplication. But if I hold down Option, or if I hold down, is it Control? Oh yeah, sorry. If I hold down Control, and this is both on Mac and Windows, if I hold down Control, I get that double dot next to my icon, and that means it's going to just copy and move this object. So if I click and drag, now I've got two cylinders. It's a really efficient way to work. I'm going to go ahead and, because I know I'm going to be shrinking all of this, I'm just going to set that there for now. I'm going to shrink the width down, or the radius down, until it more or less matches the radius of the top of that tower. And I could go look in other views to get that closer. But I know I'm going to be making some other moves here because I'm going to flat this out a little bit too. And you can see that that probably is about the right dimension. So I'm going to go ahead and slide this down until it matches there-ish. And then I'm going to go into my perspective view, orbit my view by holding 3, clicking and dragging, and look down here and just see if that seems about right. It does. It looks like a really nice match. So at this point, these 3 objects all have the same number of rotational segments, and they are not matching the rest of the model. So one of the cool things you can do is if I select the cylinder here, hold down Shift, select my cone and cylinder, you'll see that unfortunately I can't access any of my object properties except the orientation. But if I was just to select these 2 cylinders, if I select that cylinder and I hold down Control and select this other cylinder, you'll see these are mixed, but my height segments, my rotational segments are the same. So I can actually have both of those selected at the same time and hit 48 in here. And both of those objects will get the same number of rotational segments. This is really handy. There's a lot of objects where you can select multiples and change them all at once. Obviously, if objects are too different and distinct from one another, then it's not going to work. But for settings like this, it will work sometimes. So this one, I obviously have to go back in here and say 48. Okay. Now, I could, on this top one, add a bevel if I want to. I'm not going to worry about that because it's a pretty small detail. And depending on how we end up having our camera in the scene, we're probably not going to see that at all. Okay. So we have one last object we're going to add to this, which is a pyramid to go on the top. And to start with, the pyramid is going to not be open like this. It's going to be solid. And so, yeah. So we're going to go ahead and, but we're going to go ahead and add it to the scene. So let's go ahead and grab our pyramid, which is down here. And again, I'm going to drag this up. And obviously it is insanely large. So we need to decrease the size. You'll notice the settings are a little different on this. This is X, Y, and Z. And so I'm going to leave the Y alone, but the X, I'm going to set this to 10. I'm going to set the Z to 10 as well right now. And then I'm going to go ahead and say that's obviously way too tall of a spire. And it might be too narrow, so I'm going to look at my reference. It does look like it's too narrow, so I'm going to zoom in a little bit here. And I'm going to set these to, let's just do 20 and see if that's too big, or if that seems about right. If I hit H, oh, I don't know why that didn't work. There we go. If I click in the window and then hit H, that looks like it's too big now, right? If I go back to my reference, yeah, there's too much. So maybe 15 is a better setting. And again, right, I'm just sort of eyeballing this based on that one drawing that I've got. And it looks like that is probably a much better set up proportionally. Obviously, it's a little bit too tall right now. It's like as tall as the entire structure. So I'm just going to shrink this down, and it's going to move around the middle of that object. So I will go to one of these side views and maybe select this and hit H, or maybe I'll select the object and hit S, and then make this full screen and zoom out just a touch and drag down. Something to note, if you're using a trackpad on a Mac as well, 2 fingers sliding around is the same as moving the camera. 2 fingers, and obviously the zoom features are, you know, pulling your fingers apart or putting them together is going to zoom in and out for you. And I'm not sure on a Windows laptop if all of that holds true or if it acts differently, because trackpads are kind of set up a little different there. Okay, so let's see here. Let's go ahead and look at that view. Let's look at the view from here. It looks like that's probably good because right, the top of this pyramid gets cut off a little bit. If I go to my pyramid, you'll notice one of the things I cannot do with a pyramid is actually have a flatted top. And so I could potentially use a cube and actually do more work to it to make it this shape. But I'm going to go ahead and leave it as it stands right now. Okay, this is a really good stopping point. If you take a look, we started not having anything, and now we have kind of the bare bones of the model. That deck may be a little bit too big, but the only other things that need to be added on here are the cylinder and this, and basically it would be 1 cube and 1 cylinder here that seem to match about that same dimension. That's something I would like you to do on your own. I think at this point with the amount of modeling we've just done, you should be able to do that. So go ahead and do that. And then when we come back to the next one, we're going to add all of the cylinders around this array. We're going to look at some of the generators that will allow us to take one object and copy it and place it for us, which is super awesome. And then we will start to do some of the boolean required to cut these things in. We might make these shapes, and we'll figure out what the next steps are.